I built my whole identity on calling myself a feminist long before I ever believed in any god. I was the professor who stood in front of a packed lecture hall, teaching gender studies at a respected university. My specialty was religion and patriarchy, and Islam was always my strongest example. I had the slides, the quotes, the statistics. I thought I knew exactly what Islam did to women. My PhD dissertation criticized religious texts for justifying male authority. I quoted verses from the Qur'an I found online, snippets from translations that seemed to prove my point. My students took notes as I explained how hijab was a symbol of oppression, how Islamic law reduced women to second-class citizens. They trusted me. I was the expert. One afternoon, a Muslim student came to my office hours. She wore a simple navy hijab and carried my textbook in her hands. I braced myself, expecting anger or tears. Instead, she just asked calmly, "Professor, which tafsir did you use for your slides on those Qur'an verses?" I stared at her, completely blank. Tafsir? I had never read a real tafsir in my life. My sources were second-hand critical books and a few anti-Islam websites, polished enough to look academic. I lied, of course. I threw out a vague answer about multiple sources. She didn't argue. She just looked at me with a kind of sadness and said, "I thought feminists were supposed to listen to women. Why don't you ever quote Muslim women who actually love their faith?" That question followed me home like a shadow. I started digging, secretly at first. Academic pride wouldn't let me ignore it. I found articles and books written by Muslim women, theologians, activists, scholars. They were talking about Islamic feminism, a term I used to mock. I told myself I was reading their work to refute them. Instead, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years: doubt. They were using real Arabic? Original sources. Historical context. They explained how verses I had always quoted against Islam were part of a larger moral structure. They spoke about a prophet who consulted women, who defended them, who condemned men who harmed them. They talked about early Muslim women who were scholars, business owners, community leaders. One night, while preparing a lecture titled Islam and the Control of Female Sexuality, I decided to read directly from the Qur'an instead of from my usual critics. I opened a translation at random and landed on a verse speaking about men and women both being protectors of one another, both commanded to do good, both promised the same spiritual reward. I read it 3 times, waiting for the misogyny I had been sure was always there. It didn't come. I started rereading every problematic verse I had used in my classes. This time I checked multiple translations. I looked at scholarly explanations, including those by women. The easy, clean picture I used to paint in my lectures started to break. Was Islam used to justify oppression? Yes, but had I confused the behavior of some Muslims with the actual teachings of Islam? I didn't want to admit it, but the answer was also yes. The real break came during a conference. I attended a panel on Muslim women and agency, fully prepared to roll my eyes. Instead, in the back, frozen, listening to a hijab researcher explain how her faith gave her the courage to speak against cultural injustice even when it meant challenging men in her own community. She said, "Islam taught me that God sees me directly. I don't need men to validate my worth." Those words hit me harder than any theory I had ever read. That night, in my hotel room, I stared at my own reflection. I had spent years preaching about women's empowerment, but inside I was empty, anxious, constantly needing approval, students, colleagues, academic journals. I had no anchor bigger than myself. I went back to the Qur'an, this time not as an enemy, but as a confused, stubborn seeker. The more I read, the more I saw something terrifying. Consistency. A God who is just. A God who knows every hidden pain. A God who speaks directly to the human soul, male and female, without intermediaries. Verses that didn't erase difference between men and women, but also didn't erase their equal worth before him. I kept this secret for months. By day, I wore my old feminist armor, still teaching my old syllabus. By night, I was a woman sitting alone with the book I used to mock, whispering translations under my breath, and silently arguing with every line until the arguments grew weaker and the tears grew stronger. The final moment came on a random Tuesday. I walked into my classroom, opened my laptop, and looked at my lecture slides titled, Islam, a tool of patriarchal control. I couldn't speak. I looked at the students staring at me, waiting to be taught. I thought about that Muslim girl who had asked me about tafsir. I thought about the scholars I had been reading in secret. I thought about God, the God I had denied for years, who knew exactly how dishonest I had been with myself. I closed the laptop. I told them, I need to rewrite this entire course. And I need to start by admitting I spoke about a religion I never truly studied from its own sources. Some students were shocked. Some were angry. Some were curious, but for the first time in my career, I wasn't performing. I was telling the truth. That evening, alone in my office, with the door locked and the world shut out, I whispered words I had memorized days before but was too scared to say. Ashhadu alla ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasul Allah. I bear witness that there is no God worthy of worship except Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger. No lights flashed, no voices spoke from the sky. But something heavy slipped off my chest, something I had carried since I first decided I didn't need anyone but myself. I didn't stop being a feminist that day. I stopped being a feminist who was afraid of the truth, who was afraid of Muslim women's voices, who was more loyal to her ideology than to honesty. Now, when I talk about women's rights, I still fight patriarchy. I still challenge injustice. But I also bow my head to the one who created both men and women, and who never needed me to defend him only to finally listen.